everybody. I am Michael Ehline, and you are?
I'm Louis Holzberg, and I'm a maritime attorney in Miami, Florida.
And we're here today to talk to you a little bit about a recent cruise ship case. We're both cruise ship lawyers. I'm in California. He's in Florida. Tell us a little bit about your practice.
Yeah, Michael. So I am a personal injury maritime lawyer in Miami, Florida. The reason that I'm in Miami, Florida is many of the major cruise lines are based down here in Miami. We also represent passengers as well as crew members, and our practice really stems all over the world. As a matter of fact, this morning I was speaking with one of my clients in Australia, and it's interesting that the cruise industry sort of affords us this opportunity to work with potential clients really from everywhere.
Well, and I want to remind everybody that this work that we're doing here today is just educational. This is separate and apart from our work at Ehline Law Firm and his firm. And it's basically designed to help educate the public and sort of help people understand, because a lot of us have had friends that have gone on cruises and have gotten injured or hurt, or on a shore excursion and they've been totally confused. So this is a really cool example that we're going to be able to show you about a cruise ship accident case that took place, I believe, was it in Italy?
Yeah, this is breaking news, and it's a very recent event. I believe it happened overnight yesterday. So for us in the U.S., overnight, and in Italy, while a Royal Caribbean vessel was docked in Italy. Yeah.
Do you have any images or video that you can sort of show our audience to give them some perspective on what you're talking about? This is a case where it looks like someone fell in the water in between a cruise ship. I think in this case it was a passenger, but in other cases it might not be, right? It could just be a bystander that this happens to.
Yes. So this was the article actually posted about an hour ago, and some reports coming out of Europe from yesterday. But basically, a 9-year-old young man fell between the vessel and the dock itself and was trapped down there for a good while, but they were actually able to rescue him, which is a very fortunate event.
Have you ever done any cases like this in the past? And have you ever heard of cases where someone was crushed?
So I have represented passengers in the past in this scenario. Typically, it occurs when the cruise line or the dock fails to put up some sort of stanchion or some sort of barrier between the dock and the vessel itself. The other issue that can occur is that they don't extend far enough. So there'll be stanchions right at the gangway, but right when you come off the gangway, the stanchion or wall ends, and the passenger or even crew member who's unfamiliar with the area takes an errant step and ends up in the water.
And is this pretty common?
Well, in our practice, I've seen it a couple times. I believe on 3 separate occasions, I've seen versions of this. Luckily, in all of those scenarios, the passengers did survive, but there is a serious risk in these incidents. You could sustain crush damage. You could get pushed under the boat by the tides, or just by the force of the vessel itself. And it is a very dangerous situation, and the cruise lines are aware of it. Most of the time they do what they're supposed to, and they place either a stanchion, some type of visual barrier, or they place a physical barrier in the form of metal gates, much like you'd see at a sporting event or sort of crowd control type devices. But as you can see here in the picture, at this specific dock, there are no stanchions, there are no fences, there is no physical barrier. And what I assume happened is the family and or the young man went to go take a picture or get close to see the vessel in all of its glory, and they got too close and did not realize that the pier had ended at that position.
So in this particular case, a lot of people are sort of confused. I get calls sometimes. If someone was not a passenger and they fell in, would they have different rights or less rights or more rights than a cruise ship passenger might if they, say, fell overboard or fell off the dock while they were boarding or leaving the ship, departing the vessel?
There's a variety of scenarios there. The rights of a passenger vary greatly from that of a crew member, and within the different types of crew members, your rights might vary. But let's give the example of the passenger. If a passenger were to fall off the dock and injure themselves, that's one scenario. But if, for example, that passenger was to not survive, the location of the passenger in terms of where the death occurred is crucial to their case. So if somebody passes away while on a cruise ship outside of U.S. territorial waters, a law known as the Death on the High Seas Act would be implicated. And then their ability or their family's ability to recover on behalf of the estate would be limited, their damages. And it would not be like a wrongful death that happens on land or a wrongful death case that many attorneys are familiar with. It would be a completely different subset of case, which would be governed by this federal law known as the Death on the High Seas Act. In the event of a crew member, they may also be governed by the Death on the High Seas Act, but they have other rights under another federal law known as the Jones Act, and they may be entitled to other benefits, and there may be other requirements placed upon the cruise lines in such an instance. But it really depends on what dock we're talking about. So for example, had this happened in Puerto Rico, which is a U.S. territory, the analysis would be different from in this case where the passenger was injured in Italy, for example.
Got it. So in this particular case, was this a U.S. vessel or a ship that departed from the United States, or is this one of those cases where it would be covered under another convention or some other kind of treaty?
So I'm not sure specifically whether the vessel had departed from the U.S. So I'll give you the two scenarios. If this vessel was a what they call a repositioning vessel or a transatlantic vessel, then the U.S. laws would apply and a U.S. passenger ticket contract would apply. However, had this vessel been merely a week or 2-week cruise within the Mediterranean, which is what I assume was going on here, then a different contract would apply. And under that contract, the passengers' rights would be limited by an international treaty known as the Athens Convention. And then again, it's a limitation on damages, which is it's a fluctuating number, which is something called special drawing rights, and the number changes daily. So every day this amount gets reset, and depending on the date of the incident or the date of the settlement or award by a tribunal or court, then the amount could vary. So literally, if you were to settle on 1 week or the next, sort of like a fluctuating interest rate, the amount of the settlement when you convert it to US dollars might actually be slightly different. Now, it would be within a certain percentage, and you could probably predict what the value would be, but based on special drawing rights, the amount would change. Also, this is a U.S. company, so this is the Royal Caribbean Enchantment of the Seas. However, the vessel may be flagged out of a different country. Typically, Royal Caribbean's vessels are either flagged out of Liberia, so Monrovia, the capital, or they're flagged out of Malta. They may also be flagged out of the Bahamas. Now, that doesn't have much bearing on the passenger's case, but it would have a great deal to do with the crew member's case, because when a crew member agrees to an employment contract, they typically have a choice of law provision within their contract, which requires them, if they were to proceed to a tribunal, and typically that's in an arbitration, international arbitration proceeding, they've agreed to a choice of law based on the flag of the vessel. So whether that's Maltese law or Bahamian law, despite the nationality of that crew member, they typically will have to proceed under the laws of whatever the flag of the vessel is.
Show the audience anything that you think is relevant. So like, let's say you're thinking about going on a cruise, what are the things, maybe you want to check out the Enchantment of the Seas, so that's kind of what you're doing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just to give you an example, right? So the Enchantment of the Seas, in terms of Royal Caribbean's fleet, it's definitely on the older side. You can see here that the maiden voyage was in 1997. I assume they've gone through a good amount of refurbishments. And then you can find, typically it'll have Royal Caribbean listed as the owner, and then the port of registry, it says Nassau, Bahamas, you see here. So likely that means that the flag of this vessel is the Bahamas. Again, that doesn't have much bearing on the passenger's right to proceed against them, but it would have a great deal of bearing for the crew member. The Bahamas follows a similar system to British common law, and many of the laws and the damages and ability to proceed for a negligent act, such as a man overboard, would be governed by Bahamian common law, which again is similar to British common law.
Well, that's really interesting. So is there an advantage for the ship owners or the ship country of registration? Is there an advantage for the business to deal with employment type claims in those countries as opposed to under maybe the United States jurisdiction?
Most of the cases that are brought by crew members are governed by the Federal Arbitration Act. And the purpose of arbitration was to create a more efficient, streamlined alternative to court proceedings, specifically when you're dealing with parties from around the world. So the vessel may be registered in the Bahamas, the crew member may be from Eastern Europe or Southeast Asia, and then the attorneys generally are from the United States. Now, I'm just giving an example, this could vary greatly, but in those types of international proceedings, the idea is to streamline them. However, the issue becomes that the arbitration must be conducted under the law of that country, and the arbitrator typically has to be well versed in the law of that country, which means that, for example, in the Bahamas, you have to find a Bahamian arbitrator, and typically there are these arbitration companies which assist in this, and sometimes by a contract, if not all the time by contract, you've already pre-agreed to which company you're going to use. What that does in effect is creates a very limited pool of potential candidates. And unfortunately, over time, when these same candidates are seeing the same respondents or defendants and different claimants, there starts to be potential opportunities for bias. Now, I've been involved in numerous arbitrations and my clients have had great success. So I'm not here to say that there is inherent bias in the system, but there is a potentiality. And it's something that we recognize. Also, the access to the courts in terms of the Bahamas can be different. So for example, in England or in the Bahamas, they are no contingency fee agreement. So in the United States, when you're injured, you have the opportunity to hire a lawyer on a contingency basis, which means that you don't pay any money up front. There's no retainer fee, there's no deposit. Instead, your lawyer gets paid on the back end, meaning they're successful in either winning the arbitration or the court case, or you settle the case before the trial, and the lawyer takes a percentage of the claim. What this allows is a plaintiff or claimant who does not have the funds to pay an attorney by the hour can still hire an attorney and still get competent representation. If they had to hire a lawyer only in the Bahamas or only, let's say, for example, in England, they would have to pay that attorney by the hour, and typically they would be required to pay some sort of a deposit or some sort of a retainer fee.
So for a victim, especially a crew member, that seems like that could be difficult because they usually won't have that kind of money to pay, that kind of a fee, right? I mean, they're not making a lot of money, right?
No, in fact, the amount of wages that a crew member is paid typically takes into consideration the fact that they're getting room and board. So in their total compensation might look appealing in the sense that they don't have to pay rent and they don't have to pay for food. But in reality, their wages could be as low as, I don't know, maybe less than $100 a day. I've seen crew contracts that are less than $1,000 a month. And maybe in that nation where they are coming from, that's a lot more money given their education and experience that they could make otherwise. But in the totality of the circumstances, their ability to pay, let's say, a $10,000 or $20,000 retainer to a good quality lawyer would be highly limited, if not impossible.
So it sounds like it's advantageous to the cruise ship companies to have these businesses based in the Bahamas if they want to mitigate their risk of employment claims, at least.
Yes, and if we're just speaking from the lens of the personal injury maritime focus, yes. And I'm sure there are other benefits other lawyers may be well qualified to speak about with regards to taxation and other reasons for registering a vessel outside of the United States.
Makes sense. And obviously the Bahamas profit handsomely from the cruise industry, so they probably don't want to rock the boat too much, if you get my drift.
Interestingly enough, this became an issue during the pandemic. If you'll remember, the cruise industry was effectively shut down by the CDC during the pandemic, and the cruise industry was hemorrhaging money and had to look for a variety of ways to sort of keep, again, another maritime fund to keep afloat. And they, I believe Carnival was able to get outside investment, for example, but they were also looking to the US government. And one of the potential solutions was not taken into action, but was presented to the cruise lines, was to force them to register all their vessels, or at least a portion of their vessels, within the United States. And well, they're all still registered overseas, so you can imagine the decision they made.
Got it. So I guess they figured at some point the pandemic would be over. So it looks like, we've distinguished the rights between a passenger or a crew member falling over pretty well, but weren't the cruise lines, I helped draft some of this legislation. As I recall, there was a requirement for man overboard systems. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what's going on? Why isn't that happening?
So there was a variety of these vessel safety acts that were passed. There was legislation over 10 years ago with regards to sexual assault on cruises, and also regards to the man overboard drills, as well as certain systems that were supposed to be put into place to prevent or to alert the captain and the crew when somebody goes overboard. Honestly, if you go through and just Google man overboard on a cruise ship, you will probably find, if not once a month, maybe even more often, of another passenger in another circumstance where they've fallen overboard. And the cruise line gives a variety of excuses as to why these implementations haven't been put in place, but regardless, we continue to see this happening. And with the protections under DOSHA, again, the Death on the High Seas Act, they're really not incentivized to do anything, right? The ability for an attorney or a passenger's family to pursue the cruise lines for the negligence, for failure to implement these systems, or for some other cause of the reason the person fell overboard is so limited by the Death on the High Seas Act that there is no financial pressure and no legal pressure, frankly, being put on them. If a client calls an attorney with a Death on the High Seas Act case, unless it's a very specific subset of facts, meaning there are certain things that can be argued that they don't get you around the Death on the High Seas Act, but they give you the opportunity to increase the damages so that it's actually worth pursuing, both for the state and the family. Most lawyers won't take those types of cases, despite the horrible loss of life and despite the likely negligent acts of the cruise line in this circumstance.
This is real, this is sort of a little bit off, but kind of on point. In California, the medical malpractice laws were sort of like splitting the baby, a very Solomon-esque approach where they reduced our ability as lawyers to get that much money for pain and suffering, while at the same time you have to hire all these experts to prove your loss. So most of that money would come out of the pain and suffering damages. I guess the point is most lawyers won't touch those cases in California for the same types of reasons. The costs of pursuing it, the ability to prove it, and then the jurisdictional damage caps, or by treaty or whatever it might be, sort of makes it to where it's not, the client won't be able to take anything home by the time everything's paid back. Is that a fair way to look at it?
Pretty much. So what happens is that in effect, there's a cap on these damages, right? And you're basically able to recover pecuniary costs, which typically means the cost of the funeral and maybe some other tangential costs. Now, if the survivor has minor children, there are some exceptions, for lack of a better word, to DOSHA that do allow for other avenues for damages. But as you know, and many of our listeners probably know, that if you go on a cruise ship, the crowd tends to be a little bit older, and rightfully so, and they're in their retirement age, which means they while they do have probably a family, including grandchildren or even bigger than that, they don't have minor children, which means that any of those enhanced damages categories probably don't apply to them. And so even though a loved one has fallen overboard, the cruise line didn't put any implementations to protect them, whether it was the form of nets or the vague language of statutes that state that there should be some sort of detection system. There's no cameras, there's no lasers, none of this that exists in terms of what our Coast Guard has built onto their ships. Mm-hmm. There's nothing that a lawyer, frankly, can do for them. And yes, for those reasons, very similar to what's going on in California, that it's basically our hands are tied. And even if we could, find some way to get a recovery, the client would basically not be compensated, or the estate would not be compensated in that instance.
Right. And in this case, we have a law that requires, I just want to sort of give people an idea of what the sausage making process is like. So I'm going around Congress and the Senate with international cruise victims, with the late Ken Carver, God rest his soul. And we're lobbying because he lost his daughter, we think overboard. Nobody knows what happened to her. But he starts ICV. I'm helping him. We're going through Congress. We're trying to get these guys to sign on to this bill. And right behind us are these lobbyists from the cruise industry. And what do we have? We have a Solomon-esque approach where we get a law passed where we can have, where it requires these guys to have man overboard systems, but there's no teeth in the law. There's no penalty. There's no punishment. So the politicians get their donations. They please a couple of their constituents who may have gotten raped or lost loved ones overseas, but it's business as usual. Anyways, keep talking.
So no, and you're 100% right. I don't think this is something that's just a problem within the cruise industry, but again, focusing on the issues of the Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act, the main issue is that, one, the language is vague. Right. It basically states that if you have some sort of image capturing device, you've complied with the law. Well, of course they have CCTV footage on board. They don't want you to steal from their casinos. But does that comply with the law in terms of preventing man overboard? Does that comply with the law in preventing sexual assaults that are happening in broom closets or, in the cabins themselves? No, there's no CCTV footage in those places. So
and even if there is, it disappears by the time you need it for trial anyways.
Well, that's a different problem, but yes, I mean, in reality, if and when is the camera, even let's say there was a camera pointed off the side of the vessel, and these do exist, okay? Is the quality of that camera, given the Enchantment of the Seas, for example, built in 1997 or maiden voyage in 1997, is the quality of that camera up to today's standard? I'm sure we all have a better camera in our pockets.
Right. I mean, the U.S. Coast Guard, I believe they have laser man overboard systems where if you break the laser, it automatically circles the boat. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. And the U.S. Coast Guard is great, but the cruise line has to notify them timely. And the ocean is vast. So with every passing moment that they are not being notified, and there are certain protocols and systems in place to notify them, but any delay in that notification process is making it harder and harder for the Coast Guard to get out there. And if there aren't these systems in place, they may not be notified till the next morning when a family member, for example, calls to guest services and says, hey, I can't find my brother. And they don't realize that the brother, while scanned into the system, should be on board the vessel, for whatever reason, was overboard overnight. And, 6, 7, 8, 12 hours have passed. And at that point, the vessel's so far from wherever the fall might have been, to give the Coast Guard even a chance of finding someone out there, it's highly limited.
I know a guy who fell overboard and eventually got picked up, and he was out there, I think, for, almost a day and a half or something. And just hearing the story of how he survived, it was unbelievable. And it's really great that we're having this conversation, because people really need to know, like, first of all, you don't want to fall overboard, and you want to know if you do, you're going to be able to get rescued. But, we're talking old technology. It's not up to snuff like even a Coast Guard vessel would be. Yet all these cruise lines take advantage of the Coast Guard and all of our harbor and patrol services and everything we offer. The taxpayer pays all that. But they're not subject to most U.S. taxes. So just think about that. So I had one other thing I wanted to ask you. What about these people who are just walking through a dockyard and they're not a cruise ship employee? Is there a treaty or something that somehow like makes their rights less valuable than if they were, a passenger or a crew member, or more valuable? How would that work?
So, I mean, that there's a multifaceted answer to that. It just, under the basic common law, and this even goes back to British common law, if they're a trespasser, meaning they shouldn't be where they are, or they got to the dock or they got to the port, they somehow got there.
Yeah.
There's no duty to trespassers. So in that scenario, there's no responsibility on behalf of the dock owner, the maintenance company, or the cruise line. But let's say for whatever reason they are an invitee or somebody who's allowed to be on the premises or was invited onto the premises. Then in that scenario, the duty would be held by likely the dock owner. But if, for example, we're talking about here in Miami, we have two major ports, right? Port of Miami right. and Port Everglades. Both of those are owned and controlled by the counties and by the local government. Those parties are entitled to something called sovereign immunity, which means exactly what it sounds like. The sovereign, the king, is immune. So again, we have another law that prevents attorneys from assisting that passenger or that invitee because they're going to be highly limited in their damages. The sovereign immunity is the same as what we were discussing earlier. It's a cap on damages. And it seems like this is becoming the new normal, where however we can structure, or the government structures a way of limiting damages. And typically it's a lot like what you experienced probably with the cruise line lobbyists, right? They're different entities, whether it's, the port companies and the shippers, whether it's the cruise lines or pick another, entity. They're finding ways to leverage the government to limit damages so that they are insulated and protected. And then the only people who can assist pastors, assist individuals, to assist the people, as lawyers, our hands become tied. And so they are left with little to no opportunity to recover or opportunity to change the law.
And they end up hating us lawyers. I mean, I'll get a negative review because I refused to help someone, for example. And it's like, no, it's not the case. I'd be more than happy to take your money, but I'd still get a negative review because you wouldn't get any. So you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, right?
It's definitely part of the issue. I in speaking to clients and even just speaking to people, friends, when it's interesting, right? You say, that it gives lawyers a bad reputation, but then when you go to a cocktail party or you're meeting a new group of people and you say, I'm a lawyer, how often do you get asked, I have this issue, or my brother-in-law has this issue, and all of a sudden you're their new best friend, and they're getting their free consult while enjoying whatever the party is.
That's for sure. So here's the deal. I think that what we don't want to do is bore people too much, and I think we've gotten a lot of really valuable information. So I want to ask my viewers to put it in the comments if they have any questions about cruises or things coming up in the future that they'd like to know about, so we have more topics to discuss, because we want to share information that the public wants to know about. And I guess in closing, I want to ask you, do you have any advice or tips that you can give people, besides obviously not going on a cruise, on how to stay safe and how to mitigate their losses? In other words, prepare for the worst, plan for the best. Like, what should they do in advance before even going on a cruise to protect their rights as potential victims?
So I think that, Mike, that could be a whole nother show, but just sort of a quick bullet point list. First, you might want to read all of those terms and conditions and your cruise ticket contract before you get on the vessel. Second, once you're on the ship, be aware that there are those cameras everywhere, and govern yourself accordingly. And last, when you get off the vessel, especially in a foreign country, understand that you are, even though you arrived on a cruise ship and you're with a whole other host of cruise ship passengers, you are in a different place. I recommend that you do bring your passport when you get off the boat. I have heard horror stories of people who either become injured or get left behind by the vessel without any of their luggage, without any of their identification. And now they're in a position where they can't leave the country because they do not simply have their passport.
Okay, well, I think that we have our next topic already lined up, and I think that we should talk about shore excursions next time, because I've got some amazing stories of some horrific things that have happened with shore excursions, and then the cruise ship trying to get out of paying, blaming the third party that they basically hired to take you on that tour, that trip. So unless you have anything else to say, I think we should close this one out, and then I'll do a to be continued, and we'll get this thing wrapped up.
No, I just want to say thank you for having me on, and I look forward to the next one.
All right, and on that, we'll go ahead and end this for today. Thank you so much, and I'm going to leave this meeting.